Hello, my name is Hongchao. I'm from One Cloud DDN, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity to give this presentation. And this presentation is about the extension for project ID and project quota. That could be very useful in some use cases. The project ID and project quota are introduced into Lustre at 2015, and it has been a very mature and stable Lustre feature and is widely used in many Lustre deployments. It enables Lustre users and administrators to manage their files at a relatively higher level than user or group. For example, it can be manage the files or the directory according to the usage purpose. For instance, the log files, the backup files, the files that are needed to be audited. This presentation will introduce an extension for project ID and project quota. It will add more functions to the existing project ID and project quota, and to provide a better solution in some use cases. For example, the immutable files, which is used widely during backing up files in many large sites, and append-only files, which enforced to be open with append flag, is used by log files to protect the log data from being overwritten. During implementing the extension, the existing quota framework and the existing Lustre distributed log management are used to avoid complexity and keep the implementation to be relatively simple and more stable. Also, some of the flags used in this extension, for example, the immutable flag, the append flag, has been used in Lustre for a long time, so it's also relatively stable. Okay, this slide is a brief introduction about the project ID. Just like the user ID and group ID, different project ID can be set to the file or the directory. The project ID will be used to indicate which collection these files belong to, and the parent directory's project ID can be inherited by its files or subdirectories. The project ID will be the same even the users to create the files or the directories have different user ID or group ID, and this characteristic could be very useful if there are several users to work together on the files or directories for the same task. That means the project ID is more task-oriented and more useful for the collaboration among the users working on the same task. In Lustre, the project ID is 32 bits, but it's a little different for the back-end file system. The LDiskFS has 32 bits project ID, but the ZFS is 64 bits. By the way, the user ID and the group ID are also 64 bits in ZFS and 32 bits in LDiskFS. In Lustre, there is already a LFS command called lsproject to manage the project ID and the project inherited flag. It can be used to modify the project ID of a single file or the directory. It can also be used to set the project ID or the project inherited flag for all the files and subdirectories and a parent directory. It will iterate all the files and subdirectory to set the project ID and the project inherited flag. And this slide is some usage of the ls project command. For example, you can use option R to iterate some directory to set the project ID for all its files and subdirectories. Also, you can use option R and option S together to iterate the directory to set the project ID and the project inherited flag for all its files and subdirectories. Also, you can use the option C to clear the project inherit flags, and using the option key to keep the project ID from being cleared while clearing the project inherit flag. Okay, the quota flag. There is a quota flag for each quota ID. The quota ID refers to the user ID, group ID, or project ID, all called quota ID. And the quota flags can be used to control the behaviors of the files owned by that quota ID. Currently, only one quota flag that was used, which is the default quota flag. The quota ID with the default quota flag will use the global default quota setting if it has no its own quota setting. And if it was set by any quota setting by administrator, it will use its own quota setting instead of the default quota setting. Combining the project quota ID and the project quota flag will be more useful because the project ID is used to manage the files at a higher level than the group ID or the user ID. And the project ID is directory-oriented or task-oriented. The user ID or group ID is user-oriented. Then the access control enforced by the project flag will be more focused on some kind of task and is more useful at task level. Okay, let's introduce some useful project flags. The first is the immutable project flag. This flag can be used during backing up files. As you know, after the files or the directories are backed up, these files or directories are better to be set as immutable than to protect the data to be deleted and make it recoverable at any time. Setting the backup files as immutable will protect data from accidental or intentional deletion. The immutable flag is a strong lock. It's unbreakable at the standard user level. Using the project ID and project immutable flag together, and this task is relatively easy to achieve. Okay, this slide is just a little more detailed to show how to achieve the task mentioned in above slide. And step one, created the main backup directory and set the backup project ID and project inherited flag on it. Then all the files and subdirectories created in the backup directory will have the same project ID. Step 2. Copy all the files and directory which are needed to backup into the main backup directory. And the project ID of the main backup directory will be inherited by the newly created files and subdirectories. Step 3. After all the files and directory are copied into the backup directory, immutable. After the setting, all the files and subdirectories in the main backup directory will become immutable automatically because they have the same project ID. In the future, if some backup files are needed to reuse for recovery, it can just be copied out of the main backup directory. And after the file or directory are copied out of the main backup directory, its immutable flag will be cleared automatically because their project ID is different. Another interesting flag is a penned project flag. In some use cases, for example, the log files is needed to open with a penned flag to protect the existing log data from being overwritten by the new log data. Then, how can we enforce these files to be opened with a append flag? The append project flag will do its job here, creating the log directory and set the log project ID and project inherit flag on it, then setting the append project flag to this log project ID. Then all the log files in the log directory will be enforced to be opened with append flag, and an error will be returned if the log file is not opened with append flag. Okay, this slide give a little more detailed illustration about how to enforce the log files to be opened with append flag. And step 1, creating the log directory and set the log project ID on it. Then set the append project flag on the log project ID. After the setting, all the log files in this log directory will be enforced to be open with append flag because they share the same project ID. The project flags can also play a role in the security field. If some kind of files that are needed to be audited, the audit project flag can be used to generate access logs for these files. By setting audit project flags to the corresponding audit project ID, all these operations on the files owned by the audit project ID will be recorded and saved in some designated changelog file for future audit. It will use the existing changelog feature in Lustre to keep the extension to be relatively simple and more stable. Okay, this slide gives some detailed information about the process, how the project flag is set or cleared in Lustre. Firstly, the administrator set the project flag on some project ID by LFS project command at some Lustre client. Then a request will be sent to MDT0. The quota master at MDT0 will process it and save the new project flags information in its disk files. Secondly, the quota master at MDT0 will initiate a broadcast to send the new project flags information to each quota slaves in all MDTs and OSTs. The new project flags will be saved locally at each quota slaves after receiving it from the quota master at each MDT and OSTs. Finally, when MDTs and or OSTs need to get the attribute of some file or directory, it will retrieve the project flags from its quota slave and update the file or the directory's attributes accordingly. By the way, this is also the same mechanism for manage the quota setting in Lustre. For example, setting the quota hard or soft limit for some quota ID. Okay, this slide is a simple flowchart about the process of setting project flag in Lustre. As you can see, starting from the administrator, after setting the project flag by ls project command, and a request will be sent to MDT0. The quota master in MDT0 will process it and save the updated flag locally. Then the quota master will send the updated flag to all quota slaves at MDTs and OSTs by broadcaster. Then the updated flags will be used by all MDTs and OSTs to update the files of the directories attribute. Finally, the updated file or directory attribute are sent back to last client to use. And these are there are the new options that added to the LFS project command to manage the project flag. And it can be used to set or clear various project flag and such as immutable flag and panned flag. It can also show what the current flag are. The project flag can be set or cleared at any time. It will not hurt the performance very well because it doesn't operate on each file. Just like the setting the project ID on the project directory, it will iterate every file to operate on each file. The project flag is only operated on the global flags and is very quick to process. Okay, the advantage to use project flags. As you know, some of the flags, such as the immutable flag, panned flag, can also be set or cleared by generic Linux command, for instance, the chattr command. Then, what is the advantage of using project flag instead of this generic Linux command? The performance is one of the advantages. Unlike this generic command, the files or the directories are not needed to be iterated each time to set or clear some of these flags, for example, the immutable flag or the append flag. It only needed to modify the global project flag. It will affect all the files owned by that project ID. Then the performance will be much better if there are lots of files to be needed to manage. In addition to the performance, the project flags is relatively stable because it uses the existing quota framework and the existing Lustre distributed lock management. And some of the flags it uses, such as the immutable flag and append flag, has already been used in Lustre for a long time, so it's relatively stable. And furthermore, it's relatively easy to use. Just setting the global project flags, it will control all the access behaviors of the related file or directory owned by the project ID. Okay, the next steps. There will be more flags in the next steps to be introduced. For example, the encryption flags, which could be used to protect the files or the directories with some kind of password. You need to provide some kind of password if you want to access this file or the directories. Otherwise, it will be denied to access. Also, these flags can also be extended for UID and GID. Just like the project ID, the quota flags it can also be extended to work with user ID and group ID to add more behavioral access control on its files or directories. And currently, the ticket LU 14915 is tracking some works about the extension of the project ID. and if you can get further details about the extension in that ticket. There will be more ticket to be added to do this to in this extension. That's all. Thank you.